now. Welcome everyone to the 40th Virtual Roundtable on Measuring Corruption. I am delighted to be hosting today Whitney Bragagnolo, who have been working on the topic of sextortion, specifically in sports, for quite some time. And very recently, she published a new academic paper with her co-author, JANAR, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. But so when I came across this paper, it was exactly what I had been looking for, because if this is the first time that you are interacting with the topic, sextortion is relatively new, I would say, especially since at least the use of the term in the anti-corruption field. And so because it's so new, issues concerning measurement, we're still lagging behind. So I was quite excited to see that Whitney's paper had taken an empirical approach. So I immediately reached out to them to see if they would be interested in presenting their work here. So I'm very happy that finally I'm able to cover the topic of sextortion and how to measure and quantify the issue of sextortion in this series. So before I invite Whitney to start talking about the subject, and of course I'll ask Whitney for you to introduce yourself a little bit at the beginning as well. Let me just, especially for those of you who are joining for the first time, I know the majority of you have been, your frequent participants, but I see a few new faces. My name is Joseph Pochgay Alvarez. I am an associate professor at the University of Osaka. I've been hosting these monthly meetings in January 22nd. I never expected this to be running for so long, but and certainly I never expected people to continue logging in to talk about how to measure corruption from different approaches and different types of corruption. So the meeting fully today will be a little shorter than usual. Normally we run for about 90 minutes. Today we're going to do a little lighter version, so it's going to be about 60 minutes. There's no full separation between the time of presentation and the Q&A, meaning that if you have any questions or comments about any of the slides that are being showed at the moment, please don't feel too shy. You can write your question in the chat, or you can click the hand emoji, and then I will invite you to unmute yourself and make the comment. Otherwise, I'll ask you to please keep your microphone muted so as not to affect the presentation. And yeah, that is pretty much it. And of course, if you decide to ask a question or make a comment, if you could very briefly introduce yourself. Where are you based? What is your affiliation? And that way we can also get to know each other a little better. All right. So that's pretty much from my side. Whitney, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming today. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon from wherever you are. Appreciate the time, taking the time out of your day to be here, and thank you to Joseph for this invitation. So typically we present to audiences that are rooted specifically in the sports sector. So we talk to people who are involved with athlete rights, safeguarding, or legal. So it's really nice. It's a treat for me today to be able to speak to you guys, other anti-corruption experts and professionals. And I'm looking forward to hearing your insights from your industry, from your field, and from your lenses as well. So my name is Whitney. I'm a sport ethicist. My colleague and I both hold master's degrees in sport ethics and integrity. I'm also a PhD researcher in sport governance, where I focus on state responsibility in anti-corruption and safeguarding. My colleague as well is looking in the same topics in her PhD, and she's also from a legal background. So these lenses, both human rights and legal and risk ethics, shape how we approach integrity issues like the one we're going to talk about today. So in this study, we just really wanted to bring some data to this misconduct and really try to quantify, to raise awareness about sextortion, that it is everywhere. We wanted to bring awareness to who are the survivors and victims, who are the actors and perpetrators, and where are the vulnerabilities and systemic failures that allow this to persist and exist and continue. So we weren't just looking for numbers and patterns and misconduct. We were looking to understand, what's in place to protect people, what's missing, and how do we have to evolve? Because data, as we know, is really central to all of this. It's the foundation on how we create policies, on how we make good prevention, and how we start to shape our education initiatives. So prior to our research, in sport, there was no sextortion data at all. Even though, as Joseph said, the awareness around sextortion in broader industries is growing, in sport, we had nothing. So what we saw prior to our study was what we had on sextortion was more broadly focused on gender-based violence coming from that field, and it was completely out of the realm of anti-corruption work in sport. So anti-corruption work in sport, if you're not familiar, tends to focus more on match fixing, misappropriation of funds, bidding. So there was a big gap in the data, and not just in the data, but our understanding of how sextortion actually manifests and exists within our industry and with which stakeholders are responsible. And then if we want to take it a little bit further, the data that we did have that came from gender-based violence is drawn from English-speaking contexts with a Western lens. And so we have a very, very limited data set that is shaping our international policy, our education, and we were at risk of completely missing the lived realities of very many different marginalized communities. So our goal was to start to close that gap. We wanted to try to quantify sextortion in a meaningful way to move beyond just acknowledging the problem and start to kind of build a more focused picture on how it plays out across the global sports system. So what we're going to cover is a quick overview on what it is. So to make sure that we're all coming from a shared understanding, we're going to dive into the methodology, how we measure this issue, some important considerations and why they matter. And then finally, we're going to talk about that importance of diverse data. And we're going to look at the intersectional breakdown and talk about okay, where do we go from here? And what do we have to do? So I love to start off with a quote. If you have a question, just please speak up because I might have the slideshow open and I won't be able to see. I'm going to try to bounce back and forth, but just in case, please speak up. So our first quote, the president of a sport federation sent me a written message saying that in order for me to be able to direct my athletes at a certain event, I should present myself at a hotel room. I needed to wear a miniskirt. I obviously did not go, but then I was denied access to the event with no explanation. They just said the order came from above. So, sextortion is the abuse of power to obtain a sexual benefit or advantage. When people abuse their positions and power and ask for money, we understand it's often accepted that they are engaging in corruption. However, when people abuse their power to seek sexual activity, it's not always recognized as corruption and charges are rarely brought forward. So there are two components necessary for an act to be considered sextortion. You have the sexual component, which is the implicit or explicit request to engage in any form of unwanted sexual activity. Then you have the corruption component, which is that abuse of entrusted power for personal benefit, often involving coercive pressure. So sextortion is distinct from other forms of gender-based violence because it involves leveraging that entrusted power to coerce sexual acts. And it can also be non-physical. So it can rely on threats, on manipulation, or the withholding of opportunities to coerce people to consent. On the bottom of the screen here, you'll see the normative analysis, where we look at what types of norms are being challenged when we look at this phenomenon. So under gender-based violence, we're seeing denying someone the right to autonomous sexual determination grounded on the principle of autonomy. And we look at the corruption lens. We're looking at, improper exercise of public function, unethical authority, and the misuse of power. Okay, so as we all know, sextortion across... Yeah?
May I interrupt to ask a question about the previous slide?
Sure.
Thank you. Because I think that is great to have a clear understanding of how we define sextortion, especially as you mentioned, it's a relatively new term, especially when it comes to sports. It's rather completely really like we are breaking ground, or you are and Yannick have been breaking ground here. Uh, when it's a matter of transactional, kind of like a quid pro quo, which is
Mm-hmm.
the most traditional way of thinking about extortion or bribery. And
Mm-hmm.
I believe it's easier to understand that instead of talking about money, we're talking about sexual favors, right?
Yes, sex is the
Uh,
currency.
but would the term extortion also extend, for example, to situations such as that affected this the soccer coach of the female soccer team, Miss
Yes,
Rubiales?
Rubiales.
Right.
It's a great example, and one that we sometimes bring up in conversation. And I mean, if you want to look at an abuse of power, the
Mm.
rules were in place. He knew the rules. He signed off on the rules. He used his position to try to exact something. So I wish that sextortion was more a term used more in our industry, because I think that this is a really good example of it. And throughout the presentation, we will share more examples, because what we uncovered is that it's not always extremely explicit. There is a lot of gray in determining, is this abuse? Is this harassment? Is this corruption? And this is where I think a lot of the problem lies, is the conceptual clarity and
Mhm.
the unfamiliarity with the term. But it's a really great example that I think that I wish that the interdisciplinary experts really started to use these terms to familiarize people with this term, so that we can start to, move our legislation and our preventative mechanisms to acknowledge this unique misconduct. But it's a really good question.
Okay. No, thank you. I mean, that certainly clarifies it in terms of taking a little broader perspective, that it's not just about like kind of like a sexual variant of bribery per se, but we're talking about corruption more in general, as you mentioned, abuse of power, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you.
So in global industries, we know that sextortion can be enabled by things like male dominated environments, limited diversity in leadership and decision making, and also systemic inequalities to opportunities and resources. So that could be something like socioeconomic inequalities, geopolitical factors, intersectionality. But if we want to look at sports specifically, we have unique additional enablers that are specific to our industry. So what we have is cultural enablers that we see in sport that are specific, which are things like limited physical barriers, unique relationship dynamics, this emphasis on obedience that make sextortion hard to identify. So these cultural enablers, you won't necessarily see them in a bank environment or in a police environment. Like these ones are very specific to sporting environments. And then we have the institutional enablers. In sport, these are things like poor sport governance, so poor checks and balances, a concentration of power, perhaps no term limits, lack of professional capacity that allow sextortion to persist. So how does that play out? And Joseph just brought a good example. There are many. So what we see is figures like coaches, sponsors, government officials, legal professionals, people who possess entrusted power in sport can leverage that power in exchange to coerce acts, sexual acts, in favor for opportunities. So some of these opportunities might be something like access to funding, a network, scholarship, a spot on the team, career promotion, access to equipment, or the threat of losing these if the act is not agreed. So, to give you another example of how that might look like in real life, here's one from our research. I coached elite sport in Europe between 2016 and 2022. I heard many stories of older male owners signing on and exchanging contractual favors for sex. Club owners, usually older men, were taking advantage of younger girls and having regular sex, usually under the promise of better contracts. So This is an example that's a little bit more obvious, a little more explicit. We can see the quid pro quo, right? But in our research, what we found is that there was actually a lack of awareness when you looked more broadly around power dynamics and consent, which really hindered people's ability to identify this specific misconducts. We have definitions, very precise definitions of sextortion, of gender-based violence, of corruption. But what we found was, especially in the global South, people struggle to determine if their own personal situation fell within the boundaries. So to give you another example, I cannot say that this was abuse because it was also mutual. However, I did think that if I didn't agree to keep seeing him, his treatment as a coach would change, and that would affect my career. This was a female athlete from Mexico. So what we're seeing here is a fear of negative consequence, a fear of losing opportunities, a fear of retaliation, and this actually undermines true consent. When someone in a position of power, as we know, creates pressure, consent is no longer freely given, right? It becomes an abuse of authority. And so, as I mentioned in our research, the line between consent and coercion was very blurry for many stakeholders, not just athletes. The feedback that we got from athletes and from professionals really kind of showed that gray area and that dynamic that was not clear. So what we found was a lot of respondents reported that they were romantically or sexually involved with their coaches, and they believed at the time that they had consented. However, they reported to us that as they grew older and had more time to reflect as they matured, they began to realize how the power imbalance in those relationships actually did influence and compromise their ability to give true informed consent. So the consequence here is quite significant, because what we found was that many respondents believed because they had consented in that moment, they were not later entitled to report this misconduct. They were not entitled to seek support, and they believed that they were not entitled to justice. So to give you a couple scenarios about that gray area. Scenario one, why don't we go out for dinner after practice and discuss your performance? Scenario number two, if you do ... we can get you a promotion. Scenario three, you're not going to the games unless you do ... So these are examples of situations that came up that they don't neatly fit into a box. It's not clear if harassment, corruption, or sextortion occurred. But what is constant and what is across all of these scenarios is the existence of a power imbalance. And where there is a power imbalance, there is potential for abuse and abuse of power. And so that lack of conceptual clarity around consent, power, and coercion is exactly what perpetrators in sport are relying on. Because if people don't recognize power abuse, corruption can thrive. And if we want prevention to work, we have to start building in this clarity of terms into education, into governance, and to accountability from the very beginning. So now I want to get into a little bit of a survey.
May I ask another question?
Of course.
Thank you. I really like the way that you are clarifying these issues concerning the concept, because I imagine for a lot of people, and I include here myself, right? As we start using new terminology, for example, the distinction between the traditional use of the concept of sexual harassment in the workplace, right? And sextortion start becoming a little confused, and we may think, oh, why do we need a new concept when we already have that of sexual harassment? But you highlighting that here we're specifically dealing with power dynamics, which are not always, which is not always present in cases of sexual harassment in the workplace, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, when talking specifically about sextortion in sports, because a lot of the examples that you have provided immediately invite me to think about some of the scandals that we have heard over the last decade or so, in the film industry, on television, and media organizations, and et cetera, right? Do you find that there's some peculiarities about the issue or the cases of extortion that emerge specifically in the sports industry compared to other industries?
So one of the things I think really struck us is that, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the work around safeguarding right now, so we want to talk about gender-based violence, the sextortion work comes from that discipline in sport. The corruption experts in sport aren't really looking at this topic yet. We're hoping to change that through these kind of conversations. But the problem with that was we have this term gender-based violence. It's a very commonly used term in sport. It encompasses the very myriad of misconducts that you could find. Now, what happened with sextortion is that people see the word violent and they think, well, I consented, so it wasn't really violent. I wasn't raped, so I don't really fall into this doesn't pertain to me. And so we saw that, we use this term quite regularly in sport, gender-based violence. It's used in other industries, but this is the importance of, if we're going to collect data, if we want to actually look at a specific, a phenomenon in sport or in any industry, we have to make sure that the conceptual clarity is there, because regional nuances, linguistic or cultural nuances determine how people understand these things. They don't look at them the same as we do. So we have to really try to put ourselves in the shoes of the respondents to make sure that we get the accurate information that we're looking for. And for us, the lack of physical violence really confused a lot of people. So this is something that I think is really important to shine on sextortion. We talk about it is not necessarily violent, physically violent. And I think that when we only apply one lens, the gender-based violent lens, we might miss out on what these other types of interdisciplinary experts can bring to the table in expanding our understanding of different forms of misconduct. So it's a really, really good question.
I have a follow-up to that, and I'll just make it quick because I know Edward also wants to ask a question here. In a lot of other industries that I just mentioned again, like the film industry, etc., because we're dealing with larger organizations to a degree, because depending on the sport, of course, like we're talking about soccer, for example, is like well established and well funded, etc. But compliance in the sports, for example, it varies from depending on the sport, right? And in a lot of cases, the relationship between the coach and the athlete is a lot more personal and close, and without necessarily a full-on organization around them, I imagine. Do you know if the issue is also connected with how compliance in sports have developed?
Great question. We're actually going to cover this later on in the presentation, because as we know, like corruption, you can look at corruption from an individual perspective, from an isolated perspective, but more often than not, it's systemic. Right? And so in sport, compliance governance is a huge factor. It's what, as I mentioned, it's one of the institutional enablers that allow it to exist and persist. Because what we see, and I mean, I could speak, like I'm Canadian, and I can tell you that we do not have in our country, which surprises a lot of people, governance requirements of sport bodies are not mandated. So that means that sport is publicly funded in Canada by the government. They just hand money out. There is no checks and balances to ensure that organizations are running in a diligent manner. There's no requirements surrounding duty of care and the things that you would check in a normal good governance type of assessment. Now, they do exist. You have entities like the Good Governance Observer in sport, the Sports Governance Observer. You have the Association of Olympic the acronym is ASOIF. I'll share these with you guys after the presentation. And they go in to assess international federations or national federations to see, how are they doing in terms of compliance with certain levels where we should be to ensure that we are running our businesses and our industry safely, effectively, ethically. And it's not great across the world. So if we do not, and at the same time, if we do have checks and balances in place and we are looking at it from solely a compliance perspective, that's also a problem. Because what we see is a sort of a tick box assignment. Like, do we have this in place? Yes. Do we have this in place? Yes. But it doesn't say that it's working. It doesn't say that it's efficient. And I have examples of this that I'll share, but one quick one is, we'll get to this example later. Some sport entities do not have reporting mechanisms. Some do. Some have a reporting mechanism, but they don't employ a legal professional. Some do. Some have reporting mechanisms, but the athletes don't know about it, or you can't find it on their website. Some do that really well. And then there are some examples, as we'll talk about later in the presentation. They have it all good. They have an entity. They have a legal professional. The athletes know that the system exists, but the lawyer was the perpetrator. So if you don't have checks and balances and you're not asking the members that you are supposed to serve, so your athletes, are things fit for purpose, these issues will fall through the cracks. And that's why governance is so important. It is a huge enabler of corruption in sport. And I mean, to be honest, across all our industries, right? Just sport is one that I think a lot of people expect that will have the same governance standards as other industries. But it's in its infancy. We only started to do governance assessments in around 2010, really, and it's still a work in progress. So a really great question. Thank you for asking it. And we will go into that a little bit deeper.
No, thank you. That's very insightful. Sorry for making you wait, Edward. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. Sorry. Thank you very much for the invitation. First of all, I'm Edward Ivanov. I'm heading the Research Analytics Department at the International Anti-Corruption Academy in Austria. This is the international organization in charge for anti-corruption. We also conduct research on integrity and anti-corruption compliance in sport, and I'm very happy that we are on the same page. Basically, we also look at corruption from the broad perspective and analyze typologies of corruption, not limited to match fixing, etc., but also different types of corruption, embezzlement of public funds, extortion, etc. And I also wanted to ask a question. Did you focus on particular sports in your study? Because I see the list of countries and various categories depending on age and gender, but maybe you could also briefly describe which sports you analyzed in your study and if there is any differences in sports. I mean, if it depends on sport, because we also look at in our research, for example, on integrity and compliance programs. And I agree with you that some organizations have very well developed compliance programs, some mostly focus on sport-specific forms of corruption, such as match fixing, don't care much about others. And
That's
also
right.
another question, did you consider the protection of young athletes from sextortion?
Yes, of course. Great
Specifically, I
question.
mean, did you have a look at this?
Of
So
course.
thank you
Great
very
question.
much. And I would be happy, by the way, I also would like to say that we would be happy to maybe discuss cooperation in the future because we are moving in the same direction, basically.
Oh, that's good to hear. I'm happy to see that you guys are going a bit more broad in your anti-corruption work, and it's a fantastic question. In the next slide, we show all the sports that we included in the research. So I will get to that. And your second question was minors. Yes, we did pay attention to young athletes, as you can see on the screen here. We made a very concerted effort to talk to vulnerable populations, Indigenous athletes, athletes with disabilities, minors, and young athletes, because these are often, the more intersecting identities someone has, the more at risk they are to be, a victim or survivor of misconduct like sextortion. So for us, it was really important that we heard from the most vulnerable, because they will tell us, when we're doing our risk assessments, when we're building our policies and we're building our education, where must we divert our resources? Who needs the most attention? So we will cover that a little bit more moving forward, but I'm really glad that was on your radar right away, because it's not on everyone's radar, unfortunately. So just to go quickly over who we talked to, we spoke to over 500 participants. We talked to current athletes, former athletes, sport industry professionals, recreational level athletes at the community level, age 17 and up, from 51 countries. We did the survey in English and Spanish, and we ensured that we had trauma support and resources available to all participants. This is something very important, and we're trying to do ethical research, because people talking about these issues and revisiting these issues obviously could re-traumatize victims, and we want to make sure that we are respecting their dignity and making sure that they are going to be cared for. We gave around 30 multiple choice questions, as well as 2 open-ended questions. So participants could share their experience and their perspective in their own words, whatever they felt was the most important thing they wanted to express. And I have to say, we got most of our most valuable data from those 2 questions. So when we're thinking about collecting information, again, when we're doing our governance reviews and we're trying to see, you know, are our systems good? Are our people good? Are our policies good? Ask your members, ask your stakeholders. They are the experts in their environment, and they inform us on where the gaps are. So by collecting this type of broad information, we wanted to look for patterns, disparities, who is the most at risk? Can we see any systemic failures that might not be obvious? And we wanted to look beyond stats because we wanted to understand the nuances behind them and what they reveal about the bigger landscape. So we'll go through now quickly some of our overarching findings. So we surveyed 513 professionals, athletes, recreational people, and industry professionals. So we found 19. Oh, yeah.
Whitney, sorry. I just want to know how you reach to these people. You have a database, how you know that? And also, I don't know if you are gonna say this before, but it's about what is the specific question that you asked to ask these people about sextortion. Yeah.
Yes, of course. We talked at the beginning about conceptual clarity, and we have to be really clear on our terms, especially when we're talking to a global audience, a non-English audience, an audience that includes young people. So we have to be very precise in the question that we ask, and we will actually go over that specific question, and I'll explain why we worded it that way. And the other question was, how did we reach people? So we believe that we have to reach people where they are. We want to talk to athletes. Where are the athletes? They're on social media. We have a huge population of athletes all over the world. You know, this is a very, very resource-friendly way to reach people. So we used LinkedIn, of course. We used our network, of course. I'm from an alumni that consists of 150 ethicists from over 50, 60 countries. We used our network, but online, we wanted to try to get as broad as we could, and we use social media as a way to try to get out as much as we could. Okay, so yeah, what do we find? So 19% of our global respondents reported they had experienced sextortion. So this was the athletes, the enthusiasts of sport, the industry professionals. 41 of the 49 countries were impacted by it. 82%. 1 in 4 disclosed they were minors at the time of the incident. And looking at industry professionals specifically, 23% of the respondents who reported sextortion came from careers in the National Federation, in the International Federation, in NGOs, from anti-doping, from government roles, and from media. We found sextortion in 19 sports, from different levels of competition, from grassroots all the way up to elite. However, less than 1 in 5 disclosed their situation to a reporting mechanism. And for us, this was really important. We wanted to know why. Why did they not report? So what do we find? 60% said, I did not trust anything would be done by my organization to help me. 59% said, I did not trust my perpetrator would be punished. And 52% said they were worried about their career. So right here, we already have a lot of valuable data. We can show it exists. We can show it's in a lot of sports. We can show it's happening across the world. We know there's a problem around understanding consent. Now, that's a good place to start. But we didn't want to stop there, because it's in the analysis of the data and of our responses and how you choose to analyze that's going to give you the insights that we find are the most valuable. Because as we know, I see a very international group here today. If we continue to apply one-size-fits-all solutions, grouping everyone and everything together, and we don't look with a broader lens, we run the risk of overlooking people who are the most vulnerable. And we're not going to necessarily understand the unique risks and barriers that each group faces. So this leads us now into a really core part of our talk, how we analyze the data, and specifically the intersectional analysis of the data. Because if we look, for example, at this question, why did you not report? And we ask just women, or we ask just Black people, or just Indigenous people, why you don't report, you get a very different answer. So I want to show you by analyzing answers. I want to give you 6 kind of takeaways, I guess, on building better data if we want to continue this type of research in sport to help shape our prevention efforts. So we're looking at measuring corruption now beyond the numbers. And I'm going to give you 6 kind of little takeaways that we learned that we want to kind of pass forward. Number 1, again, is that power of diverse data and the importance of inclusive data collection. Those people in this room today from the Global South know already what I'm talking about. We have to collect responses from broad regions and backgrounds and identities because these are underrepresented in sport governance, in anti-corruption, in gender-based violence research. And if we don't have this understanding of the risks that these unique people face, our solutions are going to be narrow. They're going to be biased from the same dominant countries and sport systems that are shaping our research and knowledge right now. We know, everyone in this room, you're all experts here in corruption. We know it doesn't look the same everywhere, and neither do the barriers to reporting. So we have to integrate diverse data to ensure the policies and training and interventions are that they're actually grounded in diverse realities, right? So how diverse do you go? For us, because there had been no data on sextortion, we really wanted to cast a very wide net. Our goal was to try to get a very big picture so we could offer stakeholders not only initial insights, but kind of breadcrumbs to follow and build on depending on their unique context and needs. But even if you decided to look at one sport or just one country, you still have to make an effort to reach the most vulnerable. And that way, everything will become a little bit more clear as you move forward. So if you just looked at one sport or one country, are you speaking to children, to young adults, to women, are you reaching athletes with disabilities? These are very important, diverse data collections that we have to take. Takeaway 2, applying an intersectional lens to examine corruption in sport. So gathering this diverse data is the first step. But to make sense of it, it's really important that we analyze using the right lens. So intersectional analysis is a framework that examines how overlapping social identities and related structural inequalities, so for example, inequalities around race, gender, class, nationality, disability, how they shape someone's lived experience and their exposure to risk and their access to protection. So in the context of corruption in sport, when we apply an intersectional lens, we can see how these overlapping factors can combine and influence someone's vulnerability to sextortion and their willingness to report. And this allows us to really identify which groups are facing the biggest barriers, and it can allow us to really tailor our interventions to address them specifically, instead of relying on broad one-size-fits-all approaches that we know don't really work. Because as we know, corruption is not experienced uniformly. So for example, female athletes, as we found, do not report for the same reasons as men, different reasons. And individuals from low income or marginalized communities face extra barriers when they need to speak out. So again, making a really concerted effort to speak to Indigenous athletes, athletes with disabilities, women, trans and non-cisgender athletes, young athletes, minors, looking at race and ethnic origin separately. So what does that do? Where does that bring us? What does it reveal, diverse data? What's the real world impact? So one data point that we might be familiar with, everyone, is that in existing literature, it's commonly identifying harassment and abuse as being higher in elite sport. I think that's something that we probably all have heard, that in elite sport, it's more likely that someone will be affected by these misconducts. What we found was that when we examined sextortion specifically, our results showed that it occurred at the recreational and elite level at almost the same amount. So this is likely due to the even weaker level of accountability in recreational levels. So if we think about sports like jiu-jitsu and CrossFit, which are very fast-growing sports that are practiced all over the world, they don't have true governing bodies. So therefore, there are no formal structures for safeguarding, for enforcement, or for protecting their members. So this is one reason why we chose not to focus on a specific level of sport, because we wanted to look at, you know, what's happening across the broader sport experience. And then if we look at the level of sport, we can see clear regional patterns that start to emerge. So what do we find? We found that European respondents reported higher incidences in the national team. So 38% of Europeans who were survivors or victims of sextortion saw it happen in the national team. By contrast, in Africa, South America, and the Caribbean, they identified amateur sport as the most common setting. And in North America and in Asia, we saw it happening more in university and college. So what's the quick takeaways here? Well, in many regions, amateur and university sports are where situations are occurring. So imagine if we just looked at Europe. So we have to focus and look at not just elite or the Olympic umbrella. It's not sufficient. We have to look where the risk is, not where the structures exist. Okay? We can see that accountability and governance and safeguarding in post-secondary institutions needs to be looked at a bit deeper, needs to be strengthened. Reporting, access, accountability, third-party support structures. We know minors are in these post-secondary institutions. We know they're publicly funded with tax dollars. So there needs to be improved checks in these spaces too. We can't just look at the elite and Olympic umbrella. And if we go a little bit further into data analysis, we know the research shows us that coaches are often the common perpetrator. I think we've all have probably heard that in the news or in academia. However, when we looked at the Global South respondents from South and Central America, the Caribbean, and Africa, we saw a different pattern emerge. Our data found that in these regions, sponsors, government officials, sport organization leaders, so like management, administration, they were cited just as often, if not more frequently than coaches. And again, this reinforces why diverse data is so important, because without it, prevention strategies would maybe be misdirected or incomplete. If we only looked at the global north again, we would have our eyes focused on the coach when that's not everyone's reality. So continuing on, I asked earlier, and we saw on the slide, why people don't report. If we examine by region, 50% of our Global South respondents said they didn't report because they didn't trust their organization. 50%. In comparison, only 29% of Europeans gave that answer. So this sharp contrast shows that if we look at data by region, by role, or by identity, or by sport level, we uncover patterns that are very critical to effective intervention. In this case, it tells us that the trust in institutions is not distributed equally, and that reporting infrastructure might look functional on paper, but it isn't trusted or it isn't usable in different parts of the world. So again, intersectional and disaggregated data is really important to help us describe the problem more accurately and reveal who and where is most underserved and where systems are weak and what types of resources are actually needed. So we're going to continue with another Global South insight. 80% of our Global South respondents said they feared career repercussions if they refused. So in other words, 4 out of 5 respondents from the Global South said they felt like they had no choice but to consent, like so-called consent. So by contrast, 55% of Europeans, they said they felt comfortable refusing. They were not concerned about their career repercussion. So that means that 45% of European respondents believe that if they said no, that would cost them opportunity. And that's a big number in its own right. 45% is a lot of people. However, if we only looked at global average, or we only looked at Europe, this disparity would have been hidden. The vulnerability in the Global South would have been kind of buried by more moderate numbers that are in Europe, giving them a false impression that the problem is less severe than it truly is in different parts of the world. And again, highlighting why disaggregating data and examining the global south in its own right is critical. And it also exposes, you know, the deep structural inequalities in how power is experienced, and it underscores the need for these regional specific solutions. And so that brings us to the next little highlight point that I really hope you take away is the risks of the Western-centric lens. We have a very diverse group here today. This is creating some tension, I think, in the sport world right now, because you have a lot of researchers and professionals who are like, you know what, we have enough data. We have a lot of data in gender-based violence. We have a lot of data in anti-corruption, and they just want to start evolving policy. But on the other side, you have these really great researchers coming out of the global south who are really trying to challenge this dominance and are saying, you know what, the data does not apply to us. It does not reflect our reality. So if you do not apply intersectional approaches, and if sport regulations or anti-corruption programs only focus on Western data, we risk applying solutions that won't work for the rest of the world. They might even be harmful. So I kind of want that to be a takeaway point, is we really have to try to get away from this Western-centric lens and make sure that we are truly, we're like an international sport, making sure that we get international data. And we're going to come back now to defining sextortion clearly and conceptual clarity. And when we're doing research on corruption or sextortion or gender-based violence, precision matters. Okay, the misunderstanding of terms, especially when it comes to these very specific concepts, in most parts of the world, the West, the North, the global South, it's misunderstood everywhere, or it's completely unknown. So, for example, the intimate photo context of sextortion, I think you probably have heard, you know, where perpetrators threaten to share intimate images if a victim does not comply. This has more international awareness and it's more commonly understood, but it doesn't capture the wider scope of actually what sextortion misconduct can be. So as practitioners, we have to be sure that when we introduce terms, that we define them very clearly and very consistently across diverse cultural contexts, because the clarity of our terms and how well people understand them has an impact on the quality of our data, right? And the effectiveness of intervention. Misunderstood terms leads to misinterpretation and ultimately to incomplete data. Something else I think this room probably knows about, but I have found in our experience in presenting is not so thought about, is that a lot of participants are not native English speakers, which adds confusion, especially around sensitive terms or legal terms. You know, in sport, specifically in sport, we have very particular industry terms around safeguarding. And those are very clear to us as experts, so-called experts, but they're not heard outside of the system. They're inconsistently used across the world. And so what we consider best practice in terms of terminology isn't always the best understood. So we have to be aware of that when we're forming questions. So how do we ask about sextortion? This is what we ask people. This is the English version. We also had a Spanish version of the question, but did you ever receive a sexual request, offer, or suggestion ranging from being asked to send photos, to touching, to sex, to other, where you believed or you felt pressured that if you rejected the offer, you might be denied access to training, to funding, promotions, inclusion into working groups, a spot on the team, lessons, sponsorship, networking, requested time off, opportunity for special projects, or just normal expected guidance or other? Okay, now, some of you might have noticed that sextortion is not just about being denied access. It could also be about leveraging things that you have to offer. So we actually split that question up to make it a little bit more simple, because it's obviously a very lengthy question. We wanted to make sure that we gave people a very broad understanding of what sextortion could look like. Second question we asked them was looking at the offer. You know, did you believe that if you felt did you feel pressure that if you accepted an offer, they would help you? It could give you training. It could offer you promotions, that you might get a promotion, that you might get access to more lessons or sponsors or time off or more favorable treatment. So we split this also to kind of see if one aspect was more prominent than the other, like perhaps coaches may threaten to take things away, or perhaps it would be more common that people will be offered, support. That didn't transpire. It was pretty much the same, but it's important to think about, these things, and also in a new phenomenon, in a newer misconduct, give people very clear examples of how diverse an abuse of power might look like. One limitation that I think is really important to talk about that is not talked about enough in collecting corruption information, or specifically in sextortion, is we planned to offer the survey in multiple languages. So in our alumni network, we have experts from, who are Arabic speaking, who are Cantonese speaking, Russian. We wanted to deliver in at least 11 languages we had planned. However, ethics boards of our institutions restricted us to languages that were official in the country and official to the institution. So this is one really major limitation in conducting this type of work in academic systems. So even if you acknowledge the need for inclusivity and you acknowledge that needs to happen, there are potential institutional or procedural barriers that might stand in the way. And that's something that we need to think about as researchers in the community. I also wanted to touch on that some researchers in the field in academia have relied on these really great built-in translation tools that are available and are increasing with the use of AI today. And this is a risk due to the sensitivity and the precision required in a new topic like sextortion. We chose not to go that route. We felt like the lack of control over language accuracy across 11 languages or even more than 2 was too risky. So it's something to think about as well. You might not be able to control the exact translation that's given by AI technology or by software technology. So moving forward, these are risks that you have to think about and constraints, so that we can really try to ensure that participation will be equitable, but that the data will also be accurate and representative. And one of our last takeaways is looking beyond the athlete. It was important to us to look beyond the athlete. We wanted to examine the wider organizational culture, because as we know, sextortion and corruption are not limited to the playing field. So to support this understanding, we wanted to include questions that were designed to capture how people perceive power and trust and reporting inside their organizations. So these are kind of indicators to, what type of culture is surrounding misconduct. So we formed certain questions to shed light on the norms and the practices that may implicitly tolerate abuse or corruption. And rather than asking directly about the culture, we explored how individuals might experience it. So 2 questions that we asked that give an example to how we tried to do this. We asked people, are you aware of other survivors or victims in your organization or in your sport who may have been requested, offered, suggested, or pressured to engage in sexual acts of any kind, ranging from photos to touching to sex to other, from someone in a position of power in exchange for support or to avoid a harm? 52% said yes. We also asked people, how probable do you feel that someone in a position of power in your direct environment would abuse their position for obtaining a sexual benefit? And we gave people a sort of a probability, like a likelihood ranking. And these questions were to look at, is sextortion, is it isolated? Is it systemic? We wanted to really kind of hone in on that. And an important insight into organizational culture, especially because we hear that a lot, the need for culture change, came from this question and came from this finding. And what we found was 49% of industry professionals, so people who work in the industry, said that regardless of gender or their own personal experience with sextortion, they believe that it was very to definitely probable that someone in their direct environment would abuse their power for sexual gain. And this perception across the industry, it really highlights a serious issue. It reflects, not only individual misconduct here, but also a broader acceptance or expectation of abuse within the system that they are existing in. So if we have a high perception of likelihood, like we see here, this is an important factor to us, a very important indicator that can suggest that a culture of abuse of power might be tolerated, might be normalized, and a potential embedding of this behavior in the environment. And this is why changing culture and tackling phenomenon like sextortion is not just about awareness or education. As Joseph mentioned earlier, it's about governance. Because if governance is weak or inconsistent, it allows this behavior to persist and to go unchecked. So inadequate governance we see in sport can and will create and sustain poor organizational culture by failing to address misconduct, to enforce standards, and protect people. And that failure perpetuates harm, right? So if we want to go into our little deeper look, our intersectional look, Global South, what did they say?
May I interrupt for a second? We have Andrea that has been waiting to ask a question, and then we also have Obi. Andrea, please.
Great.
Hey, thank you so much, Joseph, and thank you, Whitney. I didn't want to interrupt you. This is just so brilliant and excellent. So I was like,
thank you.
Sorry to interrupt anyway. So I was just, I wanted to ask about the proposal, right? This is a couple of slides back. So both your questions ask about proposal.
Yeah.
Did your data capture any situation that there was no proposal at all? Like a situation or, that sort of veiled harassment that the athlete feels that has to comply?
Well, the purpose of asking for a proposal is because we wanted to capture the idea that maybe a person said no, right? I could be the athlete. My coach could have proposed to me an offer like, Whitney, if you do this, you will for sure make the team. I will ensure you make the team. But if I say no, technically nothing happened, right? We wanted to know, were people in their position of power abusing their authority and even making these propositions? So it was really important that we captured not only did it happen, but also who is trying to abuse the system and abuse their position of power. And what types of things are they proposing, and who are the actors and the perpetrators and the survivors in these scenarios? Does that answer your question?
Yes, Whitney, I think, the proposal, what I understood is that the proposal is a big part of the collecting data. But yes. I was thinking that your study, as we already saw, it fits in so many scenarios, in so many parts of life, that I was thinking about work environments and how, bosses can harass their employees in that sense without a clear proposal. So, you're out on a dinner party with your workmates and,
this is great.
He tries to kiss you and etc.
And so we did talk about that in the beginning, and it's in our question formation, is that it can be implicit or explicit. You could just feel that if you don't go along with something bad's going to happen to you, or if you go along with it, you get the feeling that you will be protected, you will be allowed to continue in the system. So it's a really good question. And you know what? We also worked into the end of our survey. We wanted to really focus on sextortion first. At the end of our survey, we also asked about just general gender-based violence misconduct in general, because we wanted to kind of catch people who might have fallen through the system, who might have still maybe had cultural insights to share, like what you said, Maybe it wasn't specifically sextortion, but maybe we could still show different types of abuses of power. Maybe we could show organizational culture issues. So we really wanted to make sure that people had an opportunity to share with us what they wanted to share. Now, this data was separate, but we really wanted to make sure that we casted a broad net that people could still talk about gender-based violence specifically if they needed to. But yes, I mean, for us, like you said, it happens in the office. It happens off the playing field. It happens in environments. This question here was specifically talking to professionals, not to athletes. What did the people in the industry say? So these people were in anti-doping, in government. They came from national federations, international federations, in their environment. How do they feel about their workspace? This is a pretty high number. 49% felt it was very definitely probable. So this is off the field. We wanted to show that, this, abuse of power, this abuse of entrusted power is not just something in sport that impacts athletes. It is a phenomenon across the industry, like you said, and like you recognize. And I think that looking at it only from an athlete perspective, while athletes are the most vulnerable, if we add on those lenses of global south, someone who is a minority, Black, Indigenous, person of color, someone with a disability, I mean, they're also vulnerable people. And I think I think it would be a disservice to ignore the risk within the industry in this capacity.
Before
so great.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph. Just thank you. And I think here in Brazil, it would be so much more implicit. But thank you so much, Whitney.
Great question. Thank you.
I'm sorry for interrupting, Andrea. I didn't know. Before passing the mic to Obi, I wanted to actually follow up to something that Andrea was talking about, because earlier David as well was asking if in the options provided in the survey, potentially there were scenarios that weren't so obvious in terms of the power dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
But we're thinking specifically in terms of peers, for example, teammates, right? So
right,
in team sports, for example, there's the position of the captain, and it is a position of power, potentially also influence the relationship of other members to the potential victim.
Yes.
Would that fit within our understanding of sextortion?
100%. So we actually had a few participants who said that their perpetrator was actually an idolized athlete. So imagine you're at the beginning of your career. This is someone who's senior in your sport, and they were kind of leveraging access to sponsorship, access to my network, access to my agent, or like that kind of capacity. So they felt pressure to go along with that to sustain their career, or they felt that this person might do something with their position of power, being an idolized person in the sport or in the country, that would harm their situation and endanger their career. So yes, athletes are typically vulnerable, but some athletes also wield power in their own context and can also be people who they can be perpetrators. So it's a really great question. And I noticed that, in the research prior to doing this, that I felt this was something that was missed. In my own experience as an athlete, I saw this happen. I did jiu-jitsu at a very high level, and I saw this happening in my sport. And I was like, how is the research missing this? How is the research not recognizing that athletes too can be perpetrators? We know that, of course, athletes can be perpetrators and match fixing and victims. They can be rapists. They can be, so why wouldn't they also be people who could be perpetrators of sextortion as well? We really wanted to capture that nuance and to show that, look, perpetrators are diverse, very diverse. And it would be a disservice to focus only on the coach, because that's not the case. That's not the lived reality. So thank you for asking that.
We have questions by Obi and Radim, but before we proceed, I just wanted to make sure, are you still okay with time? Because I know that we are going a little beyond what we had already at the beginning arranged. So I don't want to abuse too much of your time.
I'm okay. The questions are great, and I don't have a time constraint, so I'm happy. I think I have 2 more points to go through, and then I have a couple recommendations, and then we're good. So we're almost at the end.
Thank you so much. Obi, then please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joseph. And hi, Whitney. My name is Obi. I'm speaking from Nigeria. I'm actually on transit, but I'm very, very happy, when I saw this subject. I also work in the area of gender-based violence in Nigeria, specifically. So when I saw it, it became of very good interest. I've been thinking about this because this is a whole lot of patriarchy, masculinity in sports industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I know your study is very, very intriguing, actually. So I'm just thinking, were you able to, did you, in your study, see situations where sextortion is leading to cross-boundary crime, like drug trafficking and stuff like that? Because I'm just looking at, sextortion, where does it start and where does it lead to? So did you, in your study, see something like that? Thank you so much. And I also like to be in touch because I also work in gender-based violence.
Thank you for the question. I'm very happy to connect with everyone. We're actually working on sort of a executive summary to share with people who do not have the capacity or interest in reading a 50-page paper. So I'm happy to share that with you should you find it useful. So we focused specifically on sextortion, right? We really wanted to bring in the lens and the idea that this is not a gender-based violence only problem. This is not a only anti-corruption problem, that we have to actually look at this from a multidisciplinary perspective if we're going to get forward. So yes, I mean, of course, if you have poor governance, if you have a lack of efficient or sufficient legislation in your country, if you have a lack of, regulation and policy and procedures and a lack of professional capacity in your sport organization, sextortion is not going to be the only problem that you're likely to face. Of course, it can open the door for various types of misconduct. And so I think it's a really good point. And this comes really back to governance again, if we're looking at sports specifically. So we look away from the state responsibility and away from legislation, which we know in sextortion is very poor worldwide. We look at just sport and the regulations that we have in sport. My God, the governance is terrible. Like, it really is not great. And so if we do not improve our checks and balances and our professional capacity and ensuring things like term limits and diverse experiences on the board, and that we talk to athletes and that we consult our stakeholders like athletes and parents and, industry professionals, then these problems are, of course, going to persist and exist and go beyond sextortion. So I really for me, because I also do work in match fixing as well, every kind of integrity issue that we see in sport, dare I say, is rooted in poor governance. That's really, for me, where the core of the problem begins, and everything stems from there. When I look at a headline, right away, I trace it back to, okay, where in the organization is the hole? I will find the hole. I love to look at the weakest link because that's a really good place to start in assessing, how do we solve this problem? So it's a really good question, Obi. And yeah, I mean, these weaknesses do not just, create opportunities for this misconduct, but many. Yeah, great question. So.
Sorry, we have one more. Rodin, please go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, hello everybody. I am Radim Buresh from the Czech Technical University in Prague. I would like to thank you very much for your presentation. I do not have a question, just one remark. I am very happy that your research confirmed that sextortion, but also the other forms of corruption, is not focused only on the professional sport, but also to the amateur sports and recreational sport, because it's the same as our research with Christina confirmed as well. And of course, I was happy to see that my alma mater is umbrella for your research, and I will be happy to meet you while being in Prague again. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for the comment. It's nice to see other professionals from Czechia here. It's great, and I'm glad to hear that different universities in the area are pursuing this research, because again, we need the diverse perspectives, and Eastern Europe, the global South, Mexico, Brazil. There's all kinds of phenomenal information, but it's really how do I say it? You know, it's really overshined by what's coming out of the the West. Certain countries, Canada, Germany, Netherlands, UK, USA, and again, these research, while very rich and offers a lot of information, does not capture the full picture. So it's really great to hear of other corners of the world who are doing this and focused on this. So thank you for that. So where did we leave off? Okay, so the last question that I was showing you guys was what people were saying who were working in the industry, who were not athletes, and they believed, 49% said they felt it was very probable that someone in their direct environment would abuse their power for trying to obtain sexual benefits. And so if we go a little bit deeper and we look at the Global South insights specifically, what we see is that 72% of those from African origin and 60% of Caribbean respondents viewed this as definitely probable. So we jump from 49%, if we looked at a global average, to we zoom into certain regions, and the numbers are very different. In contrast, look at Europe. 34% of European respondents shared that belief. So 34% of Europeans thought it's possible, very, very likely that someone would do it. 72% in African origin respondents. So, what may be clearly recognized as misconduct in one region might be normalized in another, or even invisible in another. And again, this kind of helps us show why relying on solely Western-centric or Northern-centric frameworks and data sets is inadequate. We really need to look at these localized approaches and they're not optional. I really believe they're not optional anymore. They are essential for really valid anti-corruption, safe and safeguarding policies to be effective, to be fair, and to be inclusive. And if we go even deeper into another vulnerable group, athletes who have disabilities, 57% of para-athletes or athletes with disabilities knew people, victims, survivors within their organization, within their sport. So this is a really high number. This was our vulnerable group that had the highest number when we asked this question. To compare Indigenous respondents, 52% of Indigenous respondents said they knew other survivors of this misconduct. Women, when we asked only women, 48% of women said they knew other survivors, they knew other victims of sextortion, versus men, 38%. So again, it's really showing the importance of getting this intersectional insight and not looking always so broadly at problems. And our last takeaway point is looking at the barriers to reporting. This is our last major takeaway for you, that mapping where sextortion and mapping where corruption exists is very important. But without understanding why people don't report, we do really miss opportunities to fix the systems that allow it to persist. So to explore this, we asked people questions. I showed them earlier, why did you not report? And so we gave them a list. We gave them a list of about 10 different bullet points, and they could choose as many that they felt was related to their personal experience. So we asked them, they could choose, I did not know where to report. There is no reporting line. I did not trust anything would be done to help me. I did not trust my perpetrator would be punished. I don't trust my organization. I actually work in the organization, and if I reported, they would know it was me. So that's why I didn't report. We gave them the option, I'm an athlete, and if I reported, they would know it was me. So I didn't report. We gave them the option, I did not feel like I needed to report. And I didn't report because I didn't think it would impact me. It wasn't going to negatively affect me, so I didn't report. So these diverse options allowed us to assess not just individual experiences, but also, again, that institutional culture. So what are the levels of trust? What is the level of fear of retaliation? What is the perceived legitimacy of the internal reporting mechanisms? And if we can cross-check these answers across different people, across different identities, like gender, race, their role in sport, then we can kind of see how the reporting obstacles differ between different groups of people. And this helped us see, which communities face greater risks, who has less trust, and where is that retaliation maybe most acute. And even without this intersectional analysis, understanding why people don't report is very critical, because it exposes the weaknesses in the system, right? Fear, distrust, retaliation, these are allowing misconduct to stay hidden and to continue. So without that understanding, if you don't ask about non-report, the data only captures a really small surface layer, and it risks kind of reinforcing the existing systems. So I want to share with you a quote that I mentioned I would touch on earlier about the lawyer. My perpetrator was a lawyer within the National Weightlifting Federation. He himself handled the reports of alleged incidences, so there was no point in me reporting. It would not go anywhere, or he would exonerate himself from the charges. So again, I like this quote a lot because it really shows us how this organization appears to be ahead of many sport organizations. They actually have a mechanism to report misconduct. The athlete knew about the mechanism. They have a legal professional in the job, not just a volunteer. They have a legal professional overseeing these very important matters. But the quote highlights that, there is failure of seemingly functioning systems. And that reminds us why inadequate governance enables harmful conduct. Okay, so now we're going to shift, looking at that diverse data again, to look at reasons for non-reporting among men and women. So just a very small intersection here. Why do women not report? What did they say? So for women, the number one reason of non-report was they felt that perpetrator would not be punished. They also didn't trust anything would be done to help them. And their last reason was they were concerned about their career. And then we asked men the same question, and you can see very different answers. The number one reason why men didn't report is they didn't really feel like there was a need to. And they didn't know where there was a line, or they weren't sure if there was a reporting line. And the last reason was about their career. So this shows that barriers to reporting are not the same among genders. They're not the same among genders. They're not the same among different countries. They're not the same within different sports. So if we want to increase reporting among men, among women, among non-binary folks, prevention and awareness has to be tailored to address their specific concerns, right? So we look at just gender here alone, it shows that the patterns are very broad. And if we want to address why women don't report, and we want women to report more, then we have to address the consequences that they're concerned about and how gender and decisions around reporting are affected by those dynamics. These findings also reinforce what we already know in the research, that if we want women to report, we have to build trust and encourage reporting. Women are prioritizing accountability for perpetrators and protection from that retaliation. So even something as simple as gender, we see very different answers. So if we want to address this problem, we have to look at it very specifically on who we want to try to help. And if we go and look at it from a BIPOC perspective, so we're looking at the Black, Indigenous, and people of color, why are they not reporting versus Caucasian respondents? The BIPOC participants, they reported significantly higher levels of distrust. So 70% of BIPOC respondents said they don't trust their organization versus 18% of those who were Caucasian. And the second reason, 72% were concerned about their careers versus 35%. So these disparities show us that systemic racism in sport doesn't just shape access to sporting opportunities, but it also impacts whether people and how people might seek justice. So when the trust in the system is low and the consequences feel high, the cost of reporting is too great and people will not report. And this increased vulnerability also shows us that for BIPOC individuals and for women, they may face heightened risk from those in power and fewer options for seeking accountability. So it's a double burden created by structural inequalities that we have in sport, right? And I guess like I would have to touch very briefly on legal frameworks. You know, we all know probably that sextortion is not typified as a crime in very many countries today. So even if survivors chose to go reporting through the legal route instead of through their sporting organization, there are barriers here. So for instance, if they wanted to go the gender-based violence legal framework, those of you from gender-based violence will know that it's not necessarily assault if an act was considered consensual. In some countries, that's the reality. In other countries, it's required to have an overwhelming use of force, threats of death or injury for it's something to be considered rape. So this is out of the question. And if we want to go report via the anti-corruption frameworks, what we see is that it's often limited to financial gains or public officials. So, you know, sextortion doesn't neatly fit anywhere, and it appears very irrelevant in sport, in the fight against corruption in sport, despite it being a very blatant abuse of entrusted power. So how do we address these gaps now? And I want to come back and finish on conceptual clarity, because conceptual clarity is not just important for athlete awareness or prevention. It's really crucial for shaping effective legislation and sport policy, because we don't want these kind of gaps that we see here, right? They let perpetrators and they let survivors fall through the cracks, because a lot of the current sextortion focus we know comes from gender-based violence professionals. But if we approach problems like sextortion from only a gender-based violence framework or a gender-based violence lens, we're going to maybe overlook the corruption-related elements that are very important. So that misuse of power, right? And at the same time, if anti-corruption professionals, we only apply their lens, they might miss the fact that, yes, there can be abuse of power that's beyond finance. There can be abuse of power that's beyond a misuse of public office. And if we apply just the sole anti-corruption lens, we might miss these very important gender-related and moral dimensions when we assess the problem. So what I want to kind of leave you with is that, effective policy responses really require considering all dimensions for better understanding and impactful solutions. So we kind of created this little oversight for you guys that shows how expert insight fits together. So addressing abuses of power really requires that interdisciplinary perspective. You'll see some overlap here, and that's intentional, right? Because each field brings very complementary strengths that help strengthen anti-corruption outcomes and helps close gaps that a single field might miss if they try to work alone. So yes, anti-corruption and human rights people recognize institutions might be at the center of prevention and accountability, but they approach it from very different perspectives. The corruption side looks at, integrity and trust in public function, and you have the human rights legal side that looks at dignity and rights protection, right? And in sport, we have this emerging safeguarding expertise area, and they bring a very distinct and unique operational focus as well. They look at trauma-informed principles, making sure that we are prioritizing protecting vulnerable and marginalized groups before harm even occurs. So safeguarding for them is very much prevention focused, ensuring the immediate protection of people inside institutions, not just sort of legal accountability and looking after violations. Then you have ethicists, where I come from, bringing another critical layer into this work. We are a very new branch, people who work in sport ethics. We draw from law, we draw from philosophy, we draw from human rights, and we draw from governance. And we help look at, we're evaluating as well fairness, we're evaluating justice, respect for human dignity across the system. And we are looking to clarify responsibility beyond just compliance, right? Because we can see the laws might be insufficient. The regulations might be insufficient. They might not be there. So we're looking at moral responsibility. So we look at it wide. We look at what types of expertise is needed, whose perspectives are missing. we do not take a single lens approach, because addressing systemic issues really requires this kind of really broad interdisciplinary collaboration. So what I hope you guys take away today is that we do need diverse data. We need to really hone in on the vulnerabilities in people, in policies, in programs. We need to look at, not only the fact that data is good for building prevention, but also it helps drive the evolution of governance, right? We can ask our stakeholders, ask our athletes, is what we have fit for purpose? Answering that question really means we have to ask athletes, especially those who are the most vulnerable. We have to input these types of questions and these conversations into gathering our risk inputs. When we're getting feedback, when we're doing governance reviews, when we're doing auditing, we have to assess, are people, are the policies, are the programs, are they efficient? We have to consult athletes, and we have to prioritize the people who are most at risk. And at this time, the Global North entities really bear the responsibility right now for more safer, more ethical sport practices worldwide. And this is why the integration of diverse data for targeted prevention on a global scale is very, very important. So again, focusing on conceptual clarity, looking for better data. We want to avoid one-size-fits-all approaches, and we want tailored responses to really hit the specific needs of the most vulnerable. And that is where I will finish off today. And with one little line that I mentioned earlier, it's really, really important that we're looking at sport, that we analyze abuse and abusive power as an outcome of institutional dynamics, so poor governance. And that is always where I would start. And these are some of the recommendations that we had in our different research. So we have two researches that we published. One is the data, and it's a mixed method. Another is a more deeper kind of conceptual analysis on the problem. But yeah, I hope that this was informative, and I'm really curious to hear from your perspectives in your own industries or in your own area, how this is going for you in assessing your problems. And, have you been able to collect data? Have you thought about, evaluating data this way? But thank you very much for your time and for being here.
Thank you so much, Whitney. I have to say this has been very, very illuminating about the specific topic of sextortion. But at the same time, I found your discussion and the information that you have provided also so, I don't know, it just makes me think a lot about some other aspects that we're missing in the way that we measure and we study corruption in general, so not just extortion, and this emphasis on intersectionality and about what we may miss if we only collect data or we only look at responses from one part of the world or from one demographic, and we try to apply those lessons to others, that type of thing that we may be missing. And I feel that that's something that in more general or traditional approaches to measurement of corruption is not something that we discuss enough. So I'm really happy, and I know you have given me a lot to think about. So I really appreciate this. I see Judith is raising her hand. Are you okay still taking one more question?
Yeah, of course, yes.
Judith, please go ahead.
Thank you so much first for the presentation. It was very insightful and also helpful for me, because I'm currently studying my master's at University of Bologna in international relations, and I took a class in anti-corruption and will write an essay about sextortion in the cut flower industry. And
sorry, what industry?
In the cut flower industry, in the flower industry.
Okay.
Exactly. And for me, it was actually interesting to look at the safeguarding process behind that. But now I also saw from your presentation, it's still a lot of data collection in this area to really implement safeguards that could be very suitable and helpful in this area. So what I heard from you is that generally, like in the governance area, it needs to be adjustments need to be made to contribute in this. But could you maybe, if you have information, share on scholars who are already maybe working on the safeguarding process, or do you know if there's some?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, obviously, I come from a sport-specific lens, right? My expertise is specifically in sport. And when I'm looking at responsibility and stakeholders who are involved, I look at the sport organizations and I look at the state. Okay, because in most cases, sport is publicly funded by tax dollars. So I don't think the responsibility should fall only on the sport organizations, but also it's a duty of the state to protect their citizens, to protect their people, and to make sure that these tax dollars aren't spent in a system that is enabling abuse, right? Now, I don't know what measures are in place in other industries. So, I mean, for example, if I know in Canada, you have an entity that oversees agriculture. And if you have, each kind of industry probably has its overarching framework to make sure that people are acting in a way that is ethical and that is like of good business practice. So I would start there and look for gaps in where you feel like there might be a duty of care, missing, where there might be room for improvement, but that might also come from your data. Like if you look at your industry and you speak to those who are, again, professionals in the industry in regards to administration and those who are on the ground actually doing the work, you might find insights on where the holes are. Because often, like, people who are experts in administration and sport don't know where the holes are. They're sitting at the top, whether it's, in international federations, in national federations, in sport organizations, and they're not really sure where the holes are. Who are the experts? The people on the ground. So I really think this is why it's important. We talk a lot in sport about letting athletes be part of the conversation, letting athletes be at the decision-making tables. And I think this is the same across all industries, that we have to ask people who are the experts in their environment, because they'll tell you where the inefficiencies are. So I think it's really good. And, I mentioned that we add multiple choice questions, but give people opportunities to speak in their own words. We got our most valuable insight from people who shared their stories in paragraphs, in sentences, and that really shined a light on us where to look more specifically. So I think that if you ask people who are in your industry, in various corners of the industry, you will be exposed to where the governance risks might be, or where the legislation risks might be. But it's interesting for me to hear that this conversation is useful outside of sport, because I really question myself, do they already do this? Am I sounding crazy by saying this because I think sport is so behind? So it's really useful for me to hear that these discussions are happening outside of sport as well, and that this kind of framework and thinking might be useful in broader corruption, because I really didn't know what I was going to get into today. I really was like, I hope this is useful for people, because we just know where we sit in the industry, right? I don't know about corruption in other industries so much, right? So thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Thank you so much.
We have one last question, Edward.
Actually, there are brief comments, if I may, very briefly. First of all, Whitney, many thanks for a very interesting study and for today's presentation. I'm happy that in many aspects, we are on the same page. Just a few observations from my side. Actually, first, we were really surprised in our study that very few sports federations and international sports organizations have specific provisions in the integrity and compliance programs related to protection and safeguarding of young athletes and children, because there is a huge specific that should be considered. Second point, and definitely see a lot of space. You mentioned that sometimes governments are involved or not involved. So I see a lot of space for public-private cooperation with various stakeholders in this field. For example, in the field of match fixing, Interpol established the International Match Fixing Task Force. Actually, the last meeting took place also in Prague, by the way. Prague becoming kind of a center to fight corruption in sport. It's a very interesting trend, yeah. But I also believe that it's possible maybe to discuss collaboration of various stakeholders in this field, because obviously we need both actions from the governments and at the same time actions from sports organizations. And you mentioned that not necessarily covered by anti-corruption and criminal laws, these issues, these violations, but it may be at least covered by sports organizations and their integrity and safeguarding programs, and maybe may cause at least disciplinary liability according to the provisions of the integrity and compliance programs of sports organizations. Finally, I already said that we would be happy to collaborate with you and other colleagues in this field. We also organize a lot of events related to anti-corruption in sport, including professional trainings, etc. And would be happy also to maybe discuss some kind of joint events, programs, awareness raising campaigns, whatever could be relevant. But many thanks once again. It's great that you started this topic, and it's really useful for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those points, and thank you for the invitation as well. You know, I think it's a real, again, I came from match fixing. So my career, I came from risk mitigation in general, and I moved into match fixing specifically because I was really interested in the lack of legislation. Again, for match fixing, it's changed a lot from when I started, entered the field in around 2014. And you see like international movement in the right direction to acknowledge the phenomenon of match fixing, but it's still behind. And then I, was looking a little bit more broadly into safeguarding and came across sextortion. I was like, wow, this is very similar to match fixing in a sense that they both have really poor international legislation. Like in Canada, sport corruption of any capacity is not a crime. So not match fixing, not sextortion at all. And I think it's a real shame that we have some phenomenal anti-corruption experts, and they don't, like in sport, so sport anti-corruption experts, and they don't look at sextortion at all, despite this is a blatant abuse of power. They kind of say, it's not our business. That's for the gender-based violence folks. That's for the abuse folks. But the people who come from gender-based violence also don't really gravitate towards it either. It kind of falls between. And I think that's a mistake. I think that this is a very unique phenomenon. And I think it really needs to be attacked from both sides. I think we do need cross-sector collaboration. I'm glad that you said it, because I mean, I've been really fighting this for years, trying to get the anti-corruption crowd to look at this as this is important as well. Match fixing is awful. I think it's also a phenomenon that needs increased attention worldwide, but we cannot let this type of abuse of power fall between the cracks. So I'm really glad that you said it and it's on your radar, because it's not on the radar. And I've presented this since 2022 to various groups, like, again, legal professionals, academics, international forums. And I always see a lot of surprised faces from lawyers, a lot of surprised faces from people from sport. Oh yeah, we didn't think of that. And so these conversations are important, that we normalize talking about it, not just in one field, but in all of our fields that are interconnected.
I can tell you that the anti-corruption crowd is paying attention more and more.
I'm glad, because in sport, I feel like we're just on a precipice of really getting the sport anti-corruption crowd forward. Like, so for example, how I became aware of sextortion was the Transparency International report on sextortion that was across global industries. So access to water, education, policing, agriculture, it was on the table. That first report left out sport. And I was like, hey, what am I asked? Like, this is a problem in sport. And then the next year they released a sport specific report. And I was like, great. I'm glad that they acknowledge that it's in our industry as well, but they didn't have any data. They pulled all their data from gender-based violence, from rape, from sexual harassment. And I was like, hold on, like, we got to collect data, because this is a very unique phenomenon. We have to show the gender-based violence crowd and the anti-corruption crowd that we have to take this more serious. So it's really good to hear that the anti-corruption crowd is becoming more aware. The safeguarding crowd and the gender-based violence professionals are taking this more seriously, but we have work to do. We still have a lot of work to do. So I hope that people will continue, taking these little breadcrumbs that we left and look at their sport, look at their country, look at grassroots, look at elite, and build on this so that we can continue to try to influence legislation in our countries. We can try to influence policy in our sport entities and try to hopefully protect more people from this misconduct.
Meetings like this are meant to, again, spread the word, update people about what type of insights are available now, are being produced and published. When this recording goes up on YouTube a month from now, then we'll have a lot more people also being able to learn and hear about the fantastic work that you and your co-author produced. Thank you so much again. I have to say, I'm very sorry. As I said at the beginning of the meeting, we had agreed that I will try my best to keep this down to 1 hour. And I'm looking here at the time, we're almost like reaching the 2-hour mark. And I'm like, oh my God, I completely broke my own word. So I'm sorry about that. But again, I'm sure that everybody enjoyed the presentation. I certainly found it, as I mentioned, incredibly insightful. And I've been paying, close attention and taking notes in ways that your work can also influence other approaches to measuring corruption in other industries and in other forms. So thank you again so much for this and for being so kind in donating your time. And I'll look forward to what you do next.
Thank you so much for the invitation and to be here, and also for everyone who took time out of their day to come and share your insights and your great questions. For me, it's also a learning experience to hear what's happening in different sectors of sport and also in the anti-corruption field. And this is my first time speaking specifically to anti-corruption experts. So thank you again very much for being here, and I appreciate it. And my colleague as well, thank you very much.
And thank you everyone again for, as Whitney just mentioned, for taking the time to join us today. I look forward to seeing you again next month for the 41st Virtual Roundtable. And I'll keep you posted on the topic as we get closer to that date. Have a beautiful morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. And hope to see you all soon. Take good care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.